Wives, submit to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. They're like, oh, he drew the short straw. Great, it's going to be one of those Sundays. Man, I wish I had brought my friend next week. Tim Keller preaching on this says it's like diving on a grenade. I actually raised my hand for this one. I was like, I want to. Because we're at the end of Colossians 3, and I wanted this passage because it comes under the heading of instructions for Christian households, and why it is charged is pretty obvious, wouldn't you say? This first line is a doozy in our 21st century American culture. In fact, and you probably have too, I've literally met people who have said they wouldn't be Christians literally strictly because of this verse alone. And, they just go, any religion that would say something like that, I'm out. It's antiquated, tone deaf, patriarchal, irrelevant, invalid. How can you believe anything that would say that? Have you encountered that? Do you think that? You may. I actually think what Josh said this morning to the younger generation was in line with this. This is the one we don't like to own. Or at least one of them. It's embarrassing unless you really understand it. But actually, it's what Josh was encouraging our younger generation, but I want to encourage everybody. We don't have to be embarrassed about what we believe. It's good, and I'm hoping that as we unpack it this morning, you will feel likewise, or you will be renewed in your faith that this is actually God's way. Even my own wife said, do we have to preach on that? Tim Keller's answer to the question of why we preach on it is because it's there. We can't get around it. We can't avoid it. And it's actually good for us. And I've mentioned Tim Keller twice now because he is brilliant on the subject of marriage with his book, The Meaning of Marriage. He's also got an 8-episode podcast that unpacks marriage so powerfully, and I highly commend it to you. But let's face it, the pandemic has put new strain on marriages, hasn't it? Broken routines, being forced into close quarters like never before. It's like, I love you, but I don't know if I love being with you this much. Right? We've all experienced some of that. Just the financial concerns and the emotional toll of these days that really often just rear their head in marriage most. So if you felt the pressure of this pandemic in your marriage, you're not alone. And don't give up. You know what's amazing? Actually, the divorce rate is the lowest that it's been in 40 years. I actually looked that up thinking, I'm going to give a really good stat about how it's so high because of the pandemic. Actually, there was a flurry of divorce at the front end of it. But then actually people seem to settle in and find their way. Doesn't that give you hope and faith? Like actually, it's not a disaster. People are persevering, and these words, I think, help us to persevere all the more. By God's grace, I think He's actually forcing us to look at some of the issues that were already there in a new way. So let's not waste the pain, and let's actually put it to good use. Okay, so I have 6 verses, but frankly, it is so much. I'm really just going to focus on these first 2, verses 18 and 19. And it's back into Colossians chapter 3. And I want to make a quick note. We skipped over a few verses, but next week we're going to come back to them. I actually wanted to get to these now. And so if we can, put up those 2 verses in Colossians 18 and 19. There's the doozy. Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. So it's a hot button. I would argue this is a hot button largely because of context. The situation in which this line is being said, is being heard, is being considered. It's all about the context. And we miss out on the value of what Paul is saying if we don't consider the context. And I'm going to focus on 18 first, but trust me guys, don't worry, I'll get to you in just a moment. But actually, Paul starts with the ladies, and so will we. And why does he address the women first? Is it because they're most in need, they're the most unruly, the most unruly? They don't get it? Actually, no, this is the first bit of context we need to understand. Paul is very countercultural here because ladies in the ancient Greco-Roman world were second-class citizens. They didn't get addressed first. They got addressed second. But Paul prioritizes ladies first was first Christian. And so he addresses them first. That's our first bit of context. Ancient society. Ladies first didn't exist. Men were the kings of the castle, literally. And so what he's saying is upending social and cultural norms. Isn't that powerful? Isn't that something not to be embarrassed about? It was men first. Men were the rulers. They were the ones that determined how things were done, and they held the power unquestionably in ancient society. But when Jesus came, he arrived to a broken world, and one of the things that was broken was the way women were treated. And the early church wanted to change that. It's the other way around from what people often think. The notion that Christianity is outdated, antiquated, and sexist couldn't be further from the truth. It has been practiced that way, and people have misapplied it, no question. We know that it has been used to do those things terribly, shockingly, actually. But Jesus came to right the wrongs in the world, and this was one of them. The Bible has been misunderstood and misapplied, and so that it's been used to oppress women instead of highly regard and dignify women. And this is our first clue. It wants to highly regard women. So Paul addresses them first. Actually, one commentator says this, and we'll put it up. It's a chunk, but I'm going to read it real quick. And it says, or maybe I don't have this chunk. No, I probably don't. Okay. So it says, Greek ethics had addressed relationships within the household in a familiar pattern. This is key history, okay? Husbands and wives, parents and children, masters and slaves. This is how the rest of the passage unfolds. So it says, consistently, the interest was to help the male head of the household learn to govern his family and slaves. In their treatment of such rules, Paul and Peter transform the question from how husbands, fathers, and masters dominate to how they can imitate the love of Christ they know in their own lives by nurturing those in their care. Totally upended society in this moment. It says simultaneously, as wives, children, and slaves define their role in terms of service to Christ, they turn from being passive objects in a social world that devalues them and become instead active partners with God in His plan to bring unity to a race divided by gender, age, and economics. So men go from dominating ogres to loving imitators of Jesus. Women go from objects that are passive to actively engaged and celebrated and dignified. That's what Christianity came to do in the ancient world. Totally misunderstood exactly what at that time this meant in terms of Jesus and His work. So you see, these words were revolutionary to empower and dignify the oppressed and neglected of society. Thank you, Bible. Your aim was never to oppress women with this line. It was the exact opposite, and it still is. So you have the context of the ancient world, right? Then you have the context of God Himself, a loving God. God who ordained this verse. He wrote this verse. That's what we believe, that God wrote the Bible. He wrote this verse is absolute love. He's the very definition, the truest expression of love, and the only pure form of love in all existence. We have to think about that when we read anything in the Bible. He loves and values men, women, and children, bondservants, all exactly the same. He created us to be free and not oppressed by anyone. I mean, do you believe that? Because actually, we have to consider this. Imagine the most loving person you know, he doesn't even, or she doesn't even come close to the love of God. We have to wrap this verse in that reality, in that truth. And when he sees bondage and slavery and oppression and domination, he actually says, in the Bible, he says, if you want to please me, if you want me to act on your behalf, then I want you to fight slavery, bondage, oppression, domination. That's what he says. Isaiah 58. Do we have it? No, we don't. Okay. I was really asleep at the wheel on these. I'm going to read it to you. You can follow along. It says, free those who are wrongly imprisoned. This is the love of God. This is the heart of God. This is what he wants.
Right.
Lighten the burden of those who work for you. This is what he wants. Let the oppressed go free. Remove the chains that bind people. Share your food with the hungry and give shelter to the homeless. This is what he wants. This is the kind of guy he is. He says, give clothes to those who need them and do not hide from the relatives who need your help. Then your salvation will come like the dawn and your wounds will quickly heal. If you do this, that pleases me, I will do that. He then says, your godliness will lead you forward and the glory of the Lord will protect you from behind. And when you call, the Lord will answer, yes, I am here. He will quickly reply. We have to read Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting to the Lord in the context of this God who loves you, wives, dearly and wants to see you treated so well. Wants to see you not oppressed but dignified, empowered and free. That's the God we serve. But if we start to think, well, he is kind of like a wrathful God. He is kind of an angry God. Then we start to look through the lens of wrath and anger, and actually that is not his overwhelming characteristic and message to us. So we have to read verse 18 in light of God's love. Then the next context is our 21st century American context. This is the one we know best, right? We hear these words in 21st century America, and it just sounds so outdated. But as you can see, it was incredibly progressive. In fact, it was so progressive that it was extremely risky. Men liked to be in control and do what they pleased with women, children, bondservants, again, regarding them as property. So when these guys are preaching this, it's no wonder that they were throwing them in jail. It wasn't just because they believed Jesus. They had an ideology that was completely countercultural. This ideology threatened to upend society as they knew it. And Christianity, now this is going to get a little controversial, okay? Christianity was the women's lib of the ancient world. Okay, so that's a 70s term. That's 20th century. For our younger folks, let me put it into 21st century terms. Christianity was the Me Too movement of the ancient world. You're like, really? Can you really say that? Well, let me say this. Christianity doesn't share the same philosophy or even desire the same outcomes as women's lib or the Me Too movement of today. However, especially because Jesus isn't part of them. He's not at the center of them. But the aims and the outcomes of seeing women dignified and protected and not abused or mistreated is exactly the same. It's countercultural. It was a battle cry, and it was an outcry for righteousness and justice. I know you're still digesting that one, but actually we can see that regardless of what you compare it to, the purest form of understanding this is that not our 21st century America that seems so antiquated. Because actually Christianity and Jesus himself wants justice. He wants truth. He wants freedom. He is the embodiment of love. In the wake of the Me Too movement, powerful men were stepping down, getting fired, being sued, facing charges. That actually serves the aim of Christianity. That justice would prevail and the oppressed would go free. Christianity is not antiquated. Actually, the opposite is true. Every once in a while, modern society catches up with Christianity. That's what's true. At this very moment, Jesus is aware of all of the situations that are happening that he does not love, abuse and mistreatment. And he doesn't just celebrate when they are stopped. He is vitally involved in stopping it, and so should we be. That's what we have to read this in the context of. These timeless words about how men and women should coexist together in the home are as relevant and powerful and applicable today in America as they were 2,000 years ago in Colossae. So our job is to fully understand that and lay hold of how to live it, not dismiss it. We go, yeah, well, I believe most of it. I don't believe that piece. Or you know what? It didn't mean exactly that. So let me water it down a little bit for you. No, the strength is in the absolute, unequivocal truth of it. Our best life is perfect obedience to our Creator's instructions. That we can't water down or sugarcoat. But I am also aware of how complex these words can be as they land on our 21st century American ears, but also as they land in the context of your marriages. I'm aware of the history that some of you may have, the struggles that many of you have. Not anyone in particular in this room, but we all wrestle our way through marriage. And another context is our personal experience. Maybe you grew up in a home that held these verses but did it wrong. Maybe you yourself have tried to follow these words, but it hasn't worked. Or one spouse has held up their end of the bargain, but the other one hasn't, and you've been hurt. I get that. I get that. I have great compassion for that, because my wife and I have been married 21 years, and we are still finding our way in this complex journey. I've walked with many couples through marital issues in my pastoral experience, and I just have great empathy and compassion for those who are in difficulty. So please understand, I do not think this is easy by any means, and I don't want to minimize the difficulty of your own journey, your own struggle in marriage. But I want to continue to hold fast to the words of truth, because they are freedom and life and liberty to us if we can live them according to His Spirit. So the final context I'll mention is the history of men and women. That's a key context here, starting with Adam and Eve. So that's a huge context, because in Genesis 3, things broke down. Many of you are aware of this. Eve ate the apple. It wasn't really an apple, but you know. There was sin that entered the world, and it indelibly marked not only the world, but marriage. And because of human sin, through Adam and Eve, marriage went from harmonious glory and sort of perfect union between men and women to really what it is today. Right? I mean, after they sinned, God said this to Eve. Let's get it up. In the ESV, he says, "Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you." Well, that sounds wonderful. The NLT says this: "Your desire will be to control your husband, but he will control you." So basically, because of the curse of sin, we just became locked in this battle for control. And so Paul, knowing what he knows about the nature of the problem, is speaking directly to the problem. He's actually saying, I'm not going to just give you, the 10 easy steps. I am going to tell you exactly, because of the nature of what is wrong, how to deal with it. We see where all this strife and oppression comes from. I mean, doesn't this sound a little bit familiar? Don't we try to control each other often in marriage? Not always in all marriages by any means, but actually many of us are living out the curse. We're living out the curse rather than the glory of God's perfect vision for marriage. Or we live a bit of curse and a bit of glory, and it's exhausting, isn't it? It can just be so exhausting. So Paul is speaking to that to us today. The curse is actually timeless. The remedy to the curse in Jesus is also timeless, and these words are timeless. But isn't it interesting? I don't know if you find this interesting, but Paul says, consider marriage, like the complexity of it, the gravity of it. He says 2 sentences. Like, really? 2 sentences? Shouldn't there be like books and books that Paul wrote on how to manage marriage? Why are there only 2 sentences? I haven't even gotten to the second one, but it's coming. Again, trust me, it's coming. And again, because of how important and difficult marriage can be, man, I would just think there would be a big book about marriage, but actually the big book, the Bible, is entirely about marriage. It is a marriage book. It's about the marriage of God and His people, Jesus and His bride. So when Paul writes these 2 verses, he is literally bringing to bear all of this book. The church is the bride of Christ, and Jesus is the perfect groom who we men look to for our example. So let's get to that second verse. Colossians 3:19. But before we do that, I want to go to what God says to Adam. In Genesis 3:17, he says, "Since you listened to your wife and ate from the tree whose fruit I commanded you not to eat, the ground is cursed because of you. All your life you will struggle to scratch a living from it. It will grow thorns and thistles for you, though you will eat of its grains. By the sweat of your brow will you have food to eat until you return to the ground from which you were made." What an abysmal future that the curse brought. And I just want to point out, you listen to your wife doesn't mean don't listen to your wife. Please, guys, do not point to this verse and say, "See, I'm not supposed to." What God is saying here is, your wife contradicted me and you chose her instead. Because of that, work is going to be hard and toilsome basically until you die. Okay, excellent future. But we do see that Eve started the ball rolling, and yet it lands firmly in Adam's court. Accountability for obedience in the marriage relationship lands on the man, according to the Bible. Doesn't mean we don't have responsibility, both of us. But God holds the man to account here. So it may seem like I've spent quite a lot of time on that first verse 18, but actually I've been talking about verse 19. The instructions to the man this whole time, because of the context of all of this is reversing the male-dominated curse of sin and the oppressive treatment of women. Then it all flows from how we as men take up that mantle as servants of our wives and families. One of the other reasons that people bristle with these verses is because it sounds like the woman's job is hard, but the man's job is easy, right? I mean, honestly, women submit, men love. Don't be harsh. Nobody likes to submit, and everyone likes to love. Isn't that true? What kind of nonsense is this, ladies? Am I right? You guys have to submit. We just have to love. That's so sweet. We just have to love. And that's just a misreading of this. It's a misunderstanding of this. Because love in our day is like a heart-shaped box of chocolates and like a date night every so often. That's not what we're talking about here. Isn't that so loving? There's nothing wrong with those things, but actually that's not the kind of love that Paul is describing. In Ephesians 5, a similar passage talking to husbands and wives, he says, "For husbands, this means love your wives just as Christ loved the church. He gave up his life for her." Oh, that kind of love. You mean death, not chocolates and a date.
Right.
That's a very different kind of love, guys. It's not just warm fuzzies. It's not just flowers at the end of a hard week, although these are excellent, ladies, don't get me wrong. But we have to understand love. It's death. Maybe even physical death. But definitely death to everything you want in order to serve her. That's what happened to Jesus. When Jesus was in the garden, he said to the Lord, "If there's any other way this cup can pass from me, please let it, but not my will, yours be done." We have to look at every time we have a sacrifice to make or our own will to be subjugated in the service of our wives, we have to say, man, if there's any other way for this cup to pass, but not my will, yours be done. That's the love that he demonstrated. It would be evident that Jesus' first choice was not to do that. Because he said, if there's any other way, can we please do that? But actually, instead, the Lord said, no, it must be this way. And so this is our model and our power for what love actually means. Marriage is not a deal you strike where you just kind of ongoingly measure the give and take, monitoring whether or not it's still worth it. It's just not what we do. In fact, Keller says this. I think I've got this one. Yes. Okay. Sociologists argue that in a contemporary Western society, the marketplace has become so dominant that the consumer model increasingly characterizes most relationships. Right? That we're historically covenantal, including marriage. Today we stay connected to people only as long as they are meeting our particular needs at an acceptable cost to us. When we cease to make a profit, that is, when the relationship appears to require more love and affirmation than we're getting back, then we cut our losses and we drop the relationship. It's a consumerist approach. But we don't have a model that is conditional on what the other person does or doesn't do. I wish we did sometimes. And because of the curse, you're not going to want to act that way. Nobody in here is going to want to do what Paul is actually saying. Not to the utmost extent. Do you realize that your natural tendency is to not want to do that? I think we just have to sort of embrace that. It helps us to know that. Women, you're not going to want to follow your sinful husbands. And men, you're not going to want to love your wives and give up your life for them. You're just not. Like, you'll be selfish. But Paul's encouraging us here. Even though human nature is our default, when it was touched by sin through this curse, actually we would want to do the opposite of what he's teaching. And then blame your spouse for it. I don't love her because she's not submissive. I don't submit because he's not loving. And the problem is we read each other's scripts. I got a text from Jordan. Help me with his last name. I love the brother. David. He has two first names. I always forget it. Jordan David. He says, Eric, I'm so glad you're preaching on verse 18 this morning. I love to remind my wife of that. And I want you to just bring it home and then drop the mic. He was kidding. But there's a little part of us that's like, yeah. But actually, we got to read our own script. Jordan, do you love 19? Do you love 19? And I know he does. Do you read 19 and do you remind your wife of 19? Oh, that's what we don't do. I just want to remind you of this verse that has been given to me as instructions. Not remind her of the things she's supposed to be doing. Because when we're both doing that, oh man, it's wonderful. He says, husbands, don't be harsh with them. But harshness is so often the norm. I was at a gas station the other day, and this guy literally yelled at his wife from across the parking lot because she took the nozzle out of his truck. And I'm just watching him did she do it wrong? I don't know. And he's barking at her. And man, I wanted to grab him by the collar and just go, be nice to her. But then I realized I'd be a bit of a hypocrite because I have not always been nice. I have not always been unharsh with my wife. We need to grab ourselves by the collar. Say, be nice to her. That's what Paul is asking us to do. Lay down your life, love her, not with the box of chocolates love, but with real, self-sacrificing, unselfish love. We need to grab ourselves by the collar, gents. Don't be like that, Eric. It's your default setting, but Jesus has given you another way. One of the main issues is how we enter marriage, right? So when we find that special person, we say, oh, he's my soulmate. We just have so much in common. And I just know everything about him, and he knows everything about me. This is what we say. And it's funny, because when I go to premarital counseling with people, we're counseling somebody right now, I said this. I said, just look into his eyes, look into her eyes, and they do, and they go like this, and I say, you don't know the first thing about that person. You're clueless. And in fact, you don't even know yourself very well right now. Isn't that wonderful? You don't know him, he doesn't know himself, you don't know you. It's a mess. But you think it's all just ordained by the Lord, and I trust that it is. But actually, if you don't accept that it's not because you have all this stuff in common, that's the reason you're getting married, you're going to be in trouble pretty quick. You're going to spend a lifetime getting to know this person, and you're not going to like some of what you're going to find out. Even if right in this moment you know this person and you know yourself, it's all going to change. It changes. We grow as time goes on. There are so many moving parts to this thing. If we nail it to, I just like everything about the person, we're dead in the water. It's just never going to last. You think you want 4 kids and after 1 you're done. You think you want to be a nurse and after 3 years you realize you hate it so much that you have to go back to school and take on debt to change careers. You think you'll live in this place for this long, but then that changes. Everything is up for grabs. But the marriage can't be. That's the one thing that will stay static regardless of what changes and what you discover and what happens. And I want to caveat this importantly in two ways. One, I have walked with couples through situations of abuse. And when a woman or a man is not safe in the home, that is a unique situation that requires unique action. I want to be sensitive to that. This isn't just slight discomfort and some self-sacrifice. Abusive situations are different. I'm not even saying they should be divorced, but I know that they require critical attention. The other thing is I want to talk to our single folks in the room. Maybe you're young and single and you want to be married, or you're older, you may never be married. This is not irrelevant to you. Number one, you have a clean slate. Learn it now. Remember, when I was single, I was just like soaking it in. Please tell me all I need to know. I know this thing is complex and hard. So I want to learn everything that I can. And maybe you never will be married. But actually, this helps us understand the nature of God and who to be in the world if we're going to be like Jesus. All of this is so relevant. Sometimes people go, well, if we're teaching on marriage, what are the single people going to do? They're going to listen really closely, just like I did when I was single. Because this is learning the very nature of God and how to understand this faith that we love so much. I like funerals more than weddings. My wife says I'm not supposed to say that. Because to a Christian, by their most biblical definitions, a funeral is actually life and a wedding is actually death. Am I right? Upon death, the Christian enters the full manifestation of this new life in heaven. Upon marriage, we die to self, if we do it right. And I want to go back to what we've been preaching through Colossians in 3:3, because it says here, for you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ. You've died. Like that's what we do, and we die in a whole new way when it comes to marriage. Back up one slide, the final context is in Christ. If we don't understand this in the context of Jesus and what He's given us for the sake of marriage, we will miss it. Keller says this so brilliantly. He says, a servant heart is the oil that lubricates the engine of marriage. Isn't that amazing? He said an engine operates with heavy friction. It was intended to do that. And if you don't put oil in the engine, it will seize. Marriage was actually intended to operate with friction. But if you don't have the oil of a servant heart, it will seize. Beautiful picture. Thank you, Dr. Keller. And if we're wondering why it's scratchy, sticky, or seizing, just step back and ask the question, do I have a servant heart in this? Am I willing to die? Because quite frankly, when we read that 3:3 verse and it says you've died with Christ, that's not just talking about the guys who love unto death for the sake of their wives. It's talking to all of us. I just want to end with this other brilliant quote from Keller. And he says this, when Jesus looked down from the cross, He didn't think, I'm giving myself to you because you're so attractive to me. No, He was in agony. And He looked down at us, denying Him, abandoning Him, and betraying Him. And in the greatest act of love in history, He stayed. He said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. He loved us not because we were lovely to Him, but to make us lovely. That is why I'm going to love my spouse. Speak to your heart like that, and then fulfill the promises you made on your wedding day.